Hello, brave hearts, and welcome back to Girls Who Rise. I'm so happy you're here because today is a very special day. We are about to finish our journey through Anne of Green Gables. Over the past season, we've laughed with Anne, imagined right alongside her, and watched her grow a little more with every chapter. Today, we'll experience some very big feelings together. And as we listen together, remember, it's okay if parts of today's story make you feel sad. It's okay if your heart feels a little heavy. And if it does, I want you to remember that you are never alone. We'll listen together. We'll feel those big feelings together. And we'll remember that every feeling has something to teach us. And together, just like Anne, we'll discover that even after difficult moments, hope can still find its way back to us. So let's find a cozy place where we can listen without interruptions. Get comfortable. Take a slow, deep breath in and gently breathe out. As we begin, I hope you remember something. Every story we read changes us just a little. And if Anne has taught us anything, it's that kindness matters, imagination matters, and hope is always worth holding on to. Before we return to our story, here is a little story note. Anne of Green Gables was written more than 100 years ago. Today's story has been gently abridged, which means a few parts have been shortened or made a little easier to follow. Now, let's journey back to Green Gables one last time. Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. Chapter 39, A Bend in the Road. The summer following Anne's year at Queen's Academy was one of the happiest she had ever known. For the first time in many months, there were no examinations waiting, no lessons to prepare, and no evenings spent over the table with books spread in every direction. The long days belonged to Green Gables once again, and Anne slipped easily back into the familiar rhythm of home. The mornings were busy. There were berries to gather, vegetables to tend, and preserves to make while the warm summer sun poured through the kitchen windows. Marilla always seemed to find useful work for every hour of the day, and Anne was surprised to discover that she no longer minded it nearly as much as she once had. There had been a time when she would gladly have escaped every chore for a walk through the woods. Now those everyday chores felt less like interruptions and more like a part of the home she loved. Marilla noticed it too, though she said very little. But more than once Marilla remarked that Anne had become a dependable young woman. Anne smiled whenever she heard it, even though Marilla always spoke as though she were simply stating a fact. Whenever the day's work was finished, Anne was free to wander wherever her heart led her. Sometimes she and Diana spent the afternoon beneath the trees at the orchard. Other days, they followed the winding paths through Idlewild or sat beside the lake of shining waters, talking about everything that had happened during the past year and everything they hoped the future might hold. Diana listened with great interest as Anne described life at Queen's Academy, her boarding house, and her friend Priscilla Grant. Anne, in turn, wanted to hear every bit of Avonlea news that she had missed while she was away. Before long, they were laughing over old memories and surprised at how many of the moments that had once seemed so dreadful had become some of their favorite stories. Anne thought growing older was rather funny. The things that had once made her wish the ground would swallow her up were now the very stories that made her laugh the hardest. Although Anne looked forward eagerly to attending Redmond College in the autumn, she found herself appreciating Green Gables more than ever before. During her months away at school, she had often missed the quiet fields, the familiar orchard, the peaceful evenings at home. Now that she was back, she noticed the little things she had once taken for granted, and it was these little things that made Green Gables feel like home. She noticed the way the breeze stirred the poplar trees outside her bedroom window each morning. She noticed the scent of fresh hay drifting across the fields. She noticed the comforting sound of the old clock ticking steadily in the kitchen after supper. It seemed to Anne that home had 1,000 small treasures that could only truly be appreciated after spending time away. Matthew, as always, was happiest simply having Anne at Green Gables again. He listened patiently as she told him stories about Queen's Academy, smiling whenever she became especially animated. Sometimes he walked with her as she wandered down the lane in the cool of the evening, content to let Anne do most of the talking while he listened with quiet interest. Anne had long ago learned that silence with Matthew was never uncomfortable. There were people who filled every quiet moment with conversation, but Matthew never felt the need. Somehow, his quiet company was every bit as comforting as another person's words. One evening, after they had finished bringing in the hay, Anne and Matthew paused at the top of the hill overlooking the farm. The field stretched before them, glowing softly beneath the golden light of the setting sun. Beyond the orchard, Green Gables stood peacefully among the trees, looking much as it had on the very first day Anne arrived years before. "It doesn't seem possible that I've been here so long," Anne said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it feels like I've always belonged here." Matthew smiled. "I expect you have." Anne looked at him and laughed. "That's one of the nicest things you've ever said." Matthew looked slightly embarrassed, as he often did after offering a compliment. "I only meant it was hard to imagine Green Gables without you." Anne said nothing for a moment. She simply slipped her hand through Matthew's arm, and they started walking home. The weeks passed by quickly. The orchard ripened with apples, the fields slowly changed from the bright green of midsummer to the rich gold of harvest. As September drew nearer, Anne packed a few books she wanted to take to Redmond College and helped Marilla mend the dresses she would need. Anne often thought about everything that awaited her at the college. She looked forward to new books, new teachers, and the opportunity to continue learning. Yet, as eager as she was to begin another adventure, she no longer felt the restless impatience that she might once have felt. One evening, she stood for a moment at the kitchen door before going inside. The windows of Green Gables glowed warmly in the fading light, and she could hear Matthew finishing the evening chores while Marilla called out that the tea was ready. Anne smiled and hurried into the house. It had been a very happy summer. Chapter 40. A Sudden Goodbye. Harvest was well underway. The mornings were cool, and the afternoons still pleasantly warm, and the trees were beginning to show the first hints of autumn among their green leaves. Green Gables was busy from morning until night. Matthew spent long days in the field bringing in the harvest, while Anne helped Marilla with the work around the house. There were apples to gather from the orchard, vegetables to bring in from the garden, and shelves to fill with jars that would help carry the family through another winter. One afternoon, while Anne was helping Marilla in the kitchen, Mrs. Lynde came hurrying up the lane. She usually brought news with her, but today there was something different about the way she walked. Marilla noticed it too. She set down the bowl she was mixing and wiped her hands on her apron before opening the door. "Rachel, what is it?" Mrs. Lynde stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. "Have you heard about the Abbey Bank?" she asked. Marilla shook her head. "No. Has something happened?" "The bank is closed. The money that's been kept there may be gone." For a long moment, no one spoke. Anne looked from Mrs. Lynde to Marilla. Anne understood the news was serious, even if she didn't understand all of it. She had never given much thoughts about banks or money. Marilla and Matthew had always taken care of those things. But as she looked at Marilla's face, she knew that this was more than ordinary bad news. Marilla and Matthew had worked hard for many years, setting aside whatever they could whenever there was a little money to spare. If what the people were saying was true, much of that money might be gone. Marilla slowly pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. The bowl she had been using was sitting on the counter where she had left it. "When did this happen?" Marilla asked quietly. "The news reached Avonlea today," Mrs. Lynde replied. "No one seems to know much more than that. Everyone is hoping the stories aren't true." The two women sat quietly for a few moments. Outside, Anne could hear somebody traveling along the road and the steady clatter of a horse's hooves. Everything beyond the kitchen wall seemed perfectly ordinary, yet somehow the room itself felt different. Late that afternoon, Matthew came in from the fields. His boots were dusty, bits of straw clung to his coat, and his face showed the weariness that had always come with harvest. He hung his hat beside the door, washed his hands at the sink, and took his usual place at the table. Mrs. Lynde had already gone home. Marilla waited until Anne placed supper on the table before quietly telling Matthew what she had heard. He listened without interrupting. When Marilla had finished, he did not answer right away. "Are they certain?" "I'm afraid no one knows for sure yet," Marilla answered. "But it doesn't sound hopeful." Matthew gave a slow nod. Anne watched him from across the table. He had always been a quiet man, but tonight his silence seemed heavier, somehow. She wondered if he was simply tired after another long day in the fields. When supper was over, Matthew pulled on his hat and quietly walked back outside. Anne watched him from the kitchen window as he crossed the yard to the barn. He moved more slowly than usual, stopping for a moment beside the gate before continuing on. Marilla came to stand beside her. "I've never known Matthew to worry so much," she said softly. Anne slipped her arm through Marilla's. "What will happen now?" Marilla looked out toward the barn where Matthew had disappeared from sight. "I don't know," she answered honestly. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor, and Anne could hear the familiar sounds of the farm drifting through the open window. Everything had looked exactly as it had the day before, yet somehow it no longer felt the same. Anne couldn't explain why, but a feeling of uneasiness settled over her. She hoped that by morning someone would discover there had been a mistake, and that the bank would reopen and life at Green Gables would carry on as it always had. Now and then Anne glanced through the kitchen window. She could see Matthew moving about the barnyard. Marilla turned on the lamp in the living room, and the familiar golden light filled the room. At last the back door opened. Matthew stepped inside and quietly hung his hat on the peg. Anne looked up from the book she was reading and noticed at once that he looked unusually pale. Harvest always brought long days, but tonight he seemed a little more tired than she had ever seen him. Marilla noticed it too. She laid her sewing in her lap and looked at him with concern. "Matthew," she said, "are you feeling sick?" He started toward the table as though he meant to answer, but after only a few steps he reached the doorframe, trying to steady himself. "Matthew!" Before either Anne or Marilla could reach him, he crumpled to the floor. Anne was beside him in an instant. "Matthew," she whispered, taking his hand. "Matthew, Matthew, can you hear me?" There was no answer. Marilla knelt beside him, gently calling his name over and over again, but Matthew never opened his eyes. Then Marilla stood. "Anne," she said quietly, though her voice trembled, "we must send for the doctor. Hurry." Everything after that seemed to happen very quickly. A doctor was sent for, and Anne waited beside Matthew, refusing to leave him. She listened for every sound outside, hoping each one might be the doctor. When the doctor finally arrived, he knelt quietly beside Matthew. After a few moments, he gently rose to his feet. There was nothing more anyone could do. Matthew was gone. The days that followed seemed to pass in a blur. Neighbors came to Green Gables with warm meals and quiet offers to help. Mrs. Lynde seemed to know just what needed to be done, gently taking charge of the many little things that Anne and Marilla could not bring themselves to think about. Anne thanked people when they spoke to her, but afterward she could hardly remember who had come or what had been said. It all seemed like a strange dream from which she expected to wake from at any moment. As the days passed, Anne found herself expecting to see Matthew everywhere she looked. She would glance toward the kitchen door, thinking he would come in from the fields. She would hear footsteps outside and catch herself wondering if Matthew had forgotten something in the barn. His hat still hung on its peg beside the door. His boots still stood where he had left them. Even his chair was waiting for him at the kitchen table. Marilla hardly cried at all. Instead, she rose each morning and went about her work as she always had. But Anne noticed that sometimes Marilla would stop in the middle of what she was doing and simply stand for a moment, as though she had forgotten what came next. Those quiet moments made Anne's heart ache even more than tears would have. One afternoon, Anne found Marilla standing quietly at the kitchen window looking at the barn. "I keep thinking I'll see Matthew coming across the yard," Marilla said softly. Her voice caught for just a moment, and Anne saw the tears quietly fill her eyes. Without saying a word, Anne slipped her arm around Marilla. They stood together looking out across the fields until, after a little while, Marilla gently wiped away her tears and took a steadying breath. A few days later, Marilla went to see the doctor about her eyes. She had mentioned before that reading had become more difficult, but Anne had never thought much about it. Marilla had always managed somehow. When she returned home that afternoon, Anne could tell something was wrong. Marilla took off her coat and carefully hung it up before sitting down at the table. "The doctor says my eyes are getting worse," she said. "He says I mustn't strain them any more than I have to." The kitchen was very quiet. Matthew had always been there to help. For the first time, Anne began to understand how much Green Gables depended on him. That evening, she wandered slowly through the orchard. Only a few weeks before, she had walked beneath those same trees, dreaming about Redmond College. Now those dreams didn't seem nearly as important. She stood quietly for a long time, looking back toward Green Gables. The old farmhouse looked just as it always had, warm and welcoming in the evening light. For the first time, Anne found herself wondering what would become of Green Gables. Chapter 41. All's Right with the World. The days grew quieter at Green Gables. Harvest was nearly finished, and the first leaves had begun to drift gently from the trees. Autumn was settling over Avonlea, bringing cool mornings, golden afternoons, and evenings that arrived a little earlier each day. It felt so strange that so many ordinary things still needed to be done when life had changed so completely. Marilla tried to keep life at Green Gables as normal as possible, but Anne noticed little things that she had never paid much attention to before. Marilla held books closer to her face when she read. She stopped more often while sewing, blinking as though trying to bring the stitches into focus. One afternoon, Anne watched as Marilla picked up a needle, tried to thread it. Once, then again, and again. Finally, Marilla lowered her hands with a tired sigh. Anne quietly took the needle from her. "Here," she said gently. "Let me." Marilla smiled her thanks, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Marilla's eyesight was growing worse. That evening, after supper, Anne wandered slowly through the orchard. The cool breeze carried the familiar scent of autumn across the fields. She walked to the little hill where she had so often gone to dream. Only a few weeks before, she had stood in that very place, imagining Redmond College. But now another thought kept returning. Whenever she imagined leaving Green Gables, she saw Marilla standing all alone in the kitchen window. She sat beneath the old apple tree until the shadows grew long across the fields. When she finally rose to walk back to the house, she wasn't thinking about Redmond anymore. She was thinking about home. The next morning, Anne found Marilla in the kitchen kneading bread. For a few moments, she simply watched her. Anne took a quiet breath. "Marilla," she said, "I've been thinking." "So have I," Marilla answered gently. "I've decided not to go to Redmond this fall." "Oh, Anne, you mustn't say that." "I've thought about it very carefully." "But your scholarship," Marilla said. "You've worked so hard for it." "I know. I'm not giving it up, Marilla. If I can't go this year, perhaps I'll go another year, but I don't think I could leave now." Marilla shook her head. "I'll manage somehow." Anne smiled softly. "You've always said somehow when you didn't want me to worry." Anne reached across the table and gently took Marilla's hand. "I couldn't leave you here alone." Marilla looked away for a moment. "I don't want you to give up your dreams because of me." "I'm not giving them up," Anne said quietly. "I'm only putting them off for a little while. I don't think I could enjoy being there if I knew you were here all alone." Marilla looked down. "Green Gables wouldn't seem much like Green Gables without you." Anne smiled through the tears in her eyes. Then I suppose I'd better stay. Over the next few days, Anne's thought began to turn from what she was leaving behind to what she might do next. She had earned her teaching certificate at Queen's Academy, and before long a teacher would be needed for the Avonlea school. If she could earn that position, she could help Marilla remain at Green Gables and still begin the work she had dreamed of. A few days later, Anne walked to the Avonlea library. She heard someone call her name. She turned to see Gilbert Blythe crossing the street toward her. "Hello, Anne," he said with a friendly smile. "Hi, Gilbert." It felt strange to Anne how easily they talked now. There had been a time when she would have crossed to the other side of the road rather than walk beside Gilbert Blythe. For a little while they talked about ordinary things. Then Gilbert spoke. "Anne, I'm very sorry about Matthew." "Thank you." "I heard you're hoping to stay in Avonlea." Anne nodded. "I'd like to, but I need to find a teaching position, maybe here in Avonlea." "I thought you might," Gilbert replied. "I wanted to tell you something before you heard it from someone else. A teaching position became open in Avonlea, and it was offered to me." For just a moment, Anne felt her hopes slip away. She said sincerely, "I turned it down." "You did what?" "Oh, I accepted it at first," Gilbert explained, "but after I heard about Matthew and about Marilla, it didn't seem right." He looked at Anne with a small smile. "I asked them to offer the position to you instead. I'll be teaching in White Sands." She hadn't expected this kindness. "You did that for me?" she asked quietly. Gilbert gave a little shrug. It seemed to me that you should be able to stay at Green Gables." Anne thought of the boy who had once laughed at her red hair on her very first day of school. Somewhere along the way, without her even noticing, that thoughtless boy had grown into a kind and generous young man. "Thank you, Gilbert." Anne held out her hand. "I think we've been rivals long enough." Gilbert laughed as he shook it. "I've been waiting for you to say that for years." Anne walked home with a lighter heart, eager to tell Marilla the wonderful news. Marilla looked up as Anne came through the door. "You have a look on your face as though something good has happened," she said. Anne smiled. "It has." She sat down and told Marilla about meeting Gilbert outside the library. She explained how he had been offered the teaching position in Avonlea and how he had asked the school board to offer it to her instead. For a little while, they both sat there quietly in the kitchen. Outside, the familiar sounds of Green Gables drifted through the open window, a breeze stirred through the poplar trees, and somewhere in the orchard a bird sang its lovely song. For the first time in many days, those ordinary sounds brought Anne comfort instead of sadness. Matthew's absence was still felt in every room of Green Gables, and Anne still missed him with all her heart. Life at Green Gables would never be the same without Matthew. Yet, as Anne looked around the familiar kitchen, she realized that sorrow hadn't taken away every happy moment. Green Gables was still home. After supper, Anne stepped outside. Now she understood that life sometimes took unexpected turns, and those turns could be painful. They could change everything. Yet they could also lead us somewhere we never expected to go. She lifted her eyes toward the evening sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. A gentle smile crossed her face. "God's in his heaven," she whispered softly, "and all is right with the world." And this is where we end today, brave hearts. We've reached the end of our journey through Anne of Green Gables, and what a wonderful journey it's been. Before we tuck Anne's story back onto the bookshelf, let's spend a few minutes together talking about what we heard and what we might be feeling. At the beginning of today's story, everything seemed full of promise. Anne had worked so hard at Queen's Academy. She had earned the Avery Scholarship and was looking forward to going to Redmond College. And then, without warning, everything changed. Matthew became suddenly ill and died. Green Gables didn't feel the same anymore. The house was quieter, and everywhere Anne looked, she was reminded of someone she loved very much. Marilla's world had changed too, even though she wasn't someone who cried very often. Anne could see how deeply her heart was hurting. She also realized how much Matthew had quietly done every single day and how much Green Gables depended on him. Then Anne had a choice to make. She could follow the dream that she had been working toward for so long, or she could stay at Green Gables and help Marilla. It wasn't an easy choice. It was the choice love asked her to make. And just when things felt their darkest, something unexpected happened. Gilbert Blythe, who had once been Anne's greatest rival, gave up the Avonlea teaching position so Anne could have it instead. By the end of the story, Anne realized something very important. Life wasn't going to look exactly the way she had imagined. Some dreams would have to wait. Some things would never be the same. Now, let's take a moment to think about the big feelings we found in today's story. Or maybe I should say, let's give those feelings a name, because when our feelings have names, they don't seem quite so scary anymore. Today, Anne experienced three very important feelings: grief, perseverance, and hope. Grief is the deep sadness we feel when someone or something we love is gone. Anne missed Matthew with all her heart. She noticed his empty chair at the table, his boots by the door, and all the little things that reminded her of him. Marilla grieved differently. She became quieter. Sometimes she would stop in the middle of a chore, lost in her thoughts. Everyone grieves in their own way. Some people cry, some grow quiet, and some need time before they can find the words. However you grieve, that's okay. Perseverance. Perseverance means choosing to keep going even when life becomes much harder than you expected. Anne's dreams didn't disappear, they simply had to wait. She chose to stay with Marilla because that's where she was needed the most. Sometimes perseverance doesn't look like climbing higher. Sometimes it looks like staying right where you are because someone needs you. Hope. Hope doesn't mean pretending everything is okay. Hope means believing that even after something very sad happens, good things can still grow. Gilbert's kindness gave Anne a way to stay at Green Gables. And although life can never be exactly the same, there was still hope. Throughout the season, we've shared many adventures with Anne, and along the way, we discovered something about ourselves too. Together, we've learned to recognize so many different feelings. We talked about belonging, uncertainty, gratitude, anxiety, nervousness, and confidence. We also talked about curiosity, fear, pressure, inspiration, comparison, and regret. And finally, determination, bittersweetness, appreciation, affection, and finally, the very last feelings: grief, perseverance, and hope. That's a lot of feelings. Some were exciting, some were uncomfortable, and some were very hard. But every single one of them had something to teach us, because feelings aren't something we have to hide from. They're messages. They help us understand ourselves. They help us understand the people we love. And they remind us that whatever we're feeling, we're never alone. As we finish our very first season together, there are three things that I hope you'll carry with you wherever your own story takes you. The first one is every feeling you feel is okay. Over the past episodes, we've talked about so many different feelings. Feelings aren't something we need to hide or be ashamed of. We just need to learn healthy ways to express them. And noticing them is the very first step to understanding them. The second thing I want you to remember is people can grow and change. Anne grew, Marilla grew, even Gilbert grew. None of them were exactly the same people at the end of the story as they were at the beginning. That's one of the most wonderful things about life. We all learn, we all grow, and we all can become wiser than we were yesterday. And lastly, remember that stories help us understand ourselves. We didn't just spend 13 episodes learning about Anne. We learned a little bit about ourselves, too. Stories help us understand our own hearts. They remind us that we're not the only ones who feel nervous or hopeful, excited or afraid. Sometimes a story gives us the words for feelings we didn't even know how to describe. And that's one of the greatest gifts a story can give us. Before we say goodbye for now, let's take one last slow breath together. Let's take a gentle breath in and out. It's been such a joy sharing Anne's story with you. Whether you listen to one episode or every single one, thank you for choosing to listen. Thank you for being part of my very first season of Girls Who Rise. As you go through your week, be gentle with your heart. Be curious about your feelings. Be kind to yourself. And remember that every feeling has something to teach you. You are brave. You are loved. Your story matters. This may be the end of Anne's story, but it's only the beginning of ours. Next week, I'll be sharing a special bonus episode where you can get to know me a little better. I'll tell you why I created Girls Who Rise, why stories have always been so important to me, and where I hope our journey will take us next. After that, we'll begin another wonderful adventure together with a new classic story that's in the public domain so everyone can enjoy it with us. I'd love to hear from you. What classic story would you like me to read next? Be sure to leave a comment, to like and to share this podcast with someone who loves stories just as much as you do. And don't forget to follow the show so you never miss a single episode. Until next time, brave hearts. See you soon.